Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's live stream. We're going to be talking about variables and try to specifically talk about variables migration. My name is Louis, and I'm joined today by Jacob. Jacob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob. For those that don't know me, I'm the PM that's working on the variable stream. So definitely excited to have you all here today, not only to share some information with you, but also to hear back from you as well. As a reminder, if you do have questions, toss them into the Q&A section in the chat. And today we are also joined by Akbar. Do you want to give yourself a little intro?
Hey everybody, I'm Akbar. I'm a developer advocate at Figma and super excited to be here with this amazing team.
And today we also have Jack, a guest over here from Ford. Jack, give a shout out.
Hey guys, yeah, Jack here from Ford, product designer on design systems, and super excited to be speaking with you guys about variables today.
Great. And I'm Louis, I'm a designer advocate at Figma, and I annoy Jake with bug reports. Today's agenda, we're going to be firstly talking about what you can do right now when it comes to variables. How can you migrate into the variables concept immediately? What can we add to our designs now? Then we're going to start talking about styles and how they can fit into variables as well. What does that look like? We're talking about naming. We're going to be talking about plugins as well. And then we're going to be talking about the future. And we're all very excited about the future versions of variables. So we will be touching on that. And as we said earlier, we have some special guests who will be taking over the screen share for a little bit as well. Okay. I'm calling this section variables for all because I do believe there is something that everybody can be doing right now with variables, specifically corner radiuses, paddings, and I'm calling gap because it aligns with the auto layout property. You may be calling that something like margin, but let's call them gap for now. Firstly, we need to be talking about primitives. Primitives are a concept that we're trying to introduce or have been introduced in the design system industry for a while. In terms of Figma, we're trying to introduce the concept of primitives for that foundational level of your variable structure. It's effectively calling something what it looks like. And in this instance, we have some sizes. Primitive sizes might be something like size 4 for 4, size 8 for 8. Pretty straightforward. What we then look into applying here is the semantic layer, which is really the layer we want everybody in our design system to be consuming. So whenever anybody creates a design file, we want them to be using the semantic layer of our variables and not necessarily the primitive layer, which is as it looks like. And the semantic layer describes what it does, its intention. So we might look at something like a t-shirt sizing, if you want to go down that route. I know it's quite contentious, but for example, padding small could reference size 2. This is where we start to think about aliasing more broadly and how that can really introduce a new concept into our design systems within Figma specifically, and something we maybe haven't been working with before. If we take those two examples that I just showed you, we've got that primitive collection where we have the sizes based off what they look like being aliased into that semantic collection. And then we introduce groups for each different type of semantic variable. So we have the padding group, the gap group, and the radius group. We can alias in size 2 into the radius. We can alias size 2 into the padding, and we can alias size 2 into the gap. Having these split, the padding, the gap, and the radius, enables us to be way more specific when we start to think about scoping variables down to their intended use case in our components. We could just have one padding small, but we're definitely going to be running into a situation where we need the padding in this place to be using padding small, the gap in this place to be using a different value. That's why I think it's really useful for us to be splitting up. And although we're introducing more variables, the application becomes way wider. Switching over to start talking about styles. There's 3 things I think that are really important to think about when we start to think about getting from styles into variables. The first one is semantic names. And this is also something that may be brand new to your system as you've been working in Figma historically. You may be relying solely on that primitive layer. You may be looking at red 100 as the name of your style, or if you want to get into a mindset of that semantic name within our system. So historically, we may have had yellow or yellow 400 or something like that to represent what is effectively the warning color in our system for a background. This in semantic terms and in variable terms would be called something like BG-warning. You may have a hover state for one of your surfaces that's a secondary level, surface secondary hover. You may have a text link style or variable now for the focus state, text link focus, and here's some other examples as well for that sizing that I showed you before. These names are up for grabs and maybe something that you define in your own system as a slightly different variation. However, that semantic layer is really where we want to be spending our time. The radius pill here, just to call it out, is where you just have a fully round radius. So pill in my head, fully round, therefore I'd call it radius pill. If we look at a practical example from the community, we might look at something like Twilio. I took an example of their community files they'd shared to the Figma community and dug into the styles and took a look. And as you would see, when I enter dev mode on that component, I can see the style names are being surfaced in here in a really nice semantic way. What that then means is they already have these semantic styles set up. They've done the work already, focusing on their naming conventions, which means there's a much easier transition into using variables inside of Figma based off that strong foundation. If you already have these styles set up in a semantic way and they're working for you, devs know how to find them, you maybe want to wait on jumping into variables until we support more types. If you're relying on things like typography switching and everything like that, that may mean that your semantic styles at the moment are enough for the time being. If you do need to migrate wholly in the long term, that's where you could embed all those different types. However, you might be in a situation where you do light and dark theming in different style libraries, which is what Twilio does as well. In which case, really great use case for migrating into variables right now. Additionally, as I mentioned before, there's that primitive layer that we want to introduce. That's not possible with styles. So now we need to start thinking in that variables mindset to think, I need to have that foundation primitives being aliased into semantic and then being used in my components. This is where the variable workflow does make sense right now, because you can start to introduce these concepts immediately. As an example, this palette blue 60 gets aliased into color background primary, and it gets aliased separately into color text link. As I mentioned before, we could have situations where we have one variable for loads of different use cases, but splitting them up into their intention enables us to be way more specific for their use. More variables means more application in a global sense. So if we go and want to now maybe recreate this scenario where we are, let's say I work for Twilio and I'm on the design systems team and I want to create some variables. Let me pull these slide panels back up. To create a variable, you probably all, oops, I just deleted it. You've probably all gone and created a variable already. They live in the top right of our file. Open up the panel and you can see I've already set up those sizes that I was referencing before, my primitive size and my semantic size. Well, let's go and create a new collection for these colors. I'm going to say primitive colors. Create a color variable and I'll call this palette blue 60. The hex for this is 0263E0. There's our palette. Now what we do is we go and create another collection. Call this semantic colors. The collection names don't necessarily need to be called this. I'm just using it for the ease of purpose today. I'll create another color and I'll call this color background primary. This is where I can start to use that aliasing. So I pop open the color picker, switch over to libraries and alias or reference my palette blue 60. Additionally, I'll create another color for my color text link and do the same thing. Reference alias. Now I can go and apply these. Let's create a very quick component. Apply my color background primary, and that now switches over on that instance here. If I drag this text out, I can also apply my text link, and we're now seeing that flow from primitive through semantic into application. What you're probably thinking now is, as I selected those, in that list, I'm seeing everything. And this is not what we want designers to be seeing. We only want them to be seeing that semantic layer. So when we start to think about composing our libraries, open up that variables panel again, switch back to my primitives, and I'm going to rename this collection to be underscore primitives. Adding the underscore at the front means we don't publish this out to be used and consumed by our wider design teams. So that means when we publish the file, we're only offering out that semantic level. This means that whenever I select this in my design file, I'll only ever see color background primary, and I'll only ever see color text link for those applications. In the design system itself, you will still see everything because you have access to all of that. If you don't want that to be the case, it might be the situation where you have primitives living in a separate library compared to the semantics. So you have two libraries that are aliasing between the files, and that would enable you to have that relationship, but also not expose the wrong variables in the wrong places. Okay. Thinking about how we may be remapping this in maybe a larger scale rather than individually mapping up those variables to their intentions. There's a great plugin here from Marcin called Style to Variables Converter. If I pull back my panels, you'll see on the sidebar that I've already got the color styles imported in from that Twilio library. And if I open up my plugin panel, I've got the Styles to Variables Converter plugin. Run that. You now see at the bottom 53 variables created. Open up my local variables, and I have my color styles originally already created as variables. So if you have that semantic layer that I mentioned before, this could really make that a way quicker to create the variables. And if I open up the variable styles on the right-hand side, I pop open the panel, and all of those styles are now being fed by the variables we just created. So I don't need to go and manually remap those if I don't need to. The question that naturally then comes up is, what do I do with styles? And we would encourage you to keep those styles because what we're effectively enabling you to do with the style is to build what is commonly known as a composite. If you had a situation where you needed a couple of different fills in the same situation, that's where you'd bind a few different variables into that style definition. This also means you're not going to be breaking anything. The style's value has changed, but the actual style itself still exists. Back to the collection question from before, where you maybe don't want to expose certain things in certain places. If you continue to use the styles, this may also mean that you underscore the semantic collection too. So you're just publishing out those styles. That's a decision to be made in your team, but it is an option if you'd like to investigate it. Next up, if you have maybe more than one mode or more than one theme, if you're supporting light and dark mode, for example, is this great plugin by Jan Edern called Styles to Variables. If I switch over to the separate file, you'll see on the right-hand side, I have styles for light and dark, which I've also copied in from that Twilio system. And I'll run the Styles to Variables plugin. And what that does is it picks up all the styles that we have in this file. I can name my collection. So I'll call this paste to match their design system name. And what we can do inside of here is pretty neat in that we can look at the first level of our style. So we have light and dark, and I can use that for each mode. So I can remap dark to be a mode, light to be a mode. Additionally, we can do the same thing as we did with the previous plugin, where I can bind the styles to the variables, which effectively replaces that hex value with the value from the variable itself. So if I convert these styles into variables, you can see we've got 214 variables created with 2 modes. Open up my panel, and I've now got all of them created in 3 seconds, saving me a ton of time. So I can now go and rely on those styles that have already been created. They're now being fed into my design system, fed into my design files, and all of my designers get light and dark mode effectively for free. They just need to inherit the update from the design system library once you publish it, and then we're good to go. Next up is maybe you're thinking about starting from scratch. Maybe you don't have any styles or any variables or any JSON file created yet. There's a really cool website called Swatchy, which I'm going to open up here. And this allows me to add colors to my system. I can edit the desaturation, the range, the number of colors. I can rename them. So purple here, choose a base color, maybe add another one and go for this blue here. Let's add another one as well and change this to be a pink, rename to pink, rename to blue. And what they've done here as well is added a download Figma variables option. This downloads a JSON file in Figma format, so we can then import it into Figma based off the palette we have just created. So if I download this, that comes down to my machine. What I can then do is use this variables import plugin from Travis to import the JSON I just downloaded into my file. So if I open up this plugin here, run that, and drop this colors JSON into the window, 33 variables are created. And now we have colors.json with all the palette that I just created. So if you want to start really fast with a primitive collection, that's probably the best way to do that. We saw it in a minute that we were able to create a couple of colors in a range of different steps really fast in JSON format that I could import into Figma. That JSON file could also be used by your developers and sort of then working way closer between design and development to make sure we're all on the same page. Another plugin that I won't be demoing, but I want to check out is if you want to move collections between files, this export import variables by Honza is really, really great. So go and check that one out as well. Now we're going to change pace a little bit and we're going to look at the REST API with Akbar.
Oh, there we go. Hey, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and show you a little bit more about the REST API. And so for those of you that don't know, there we go. There we go. For those of you that don't know, the REST API is a way for you to interact with the Figma via our REST API. And what that means is you can bring this into any script that you're running outside of Figma. It doesn't require Figma to be open. It enables you to create automated workflows. And so Figma doesn't need to be open. A user doesn't need to be present when using the REST API, and you can schedule a task to run whenever you need it to. It also allows for scaled performance. The REST API is built to run specific tasks performantly, and it's the best way to access data at scale. So you can access either many nodes in a single file, or you can access multiple files, which is a limitation of the plugin API, where a plugin can only run in one file, in one file as opposed to many files at once, and it requires Figma to be open. The REST API also gives you access to all of the files in your team or your workspace, as well as allowing you to create Figma integrations where the REST API can build experiences that enrich your apps with Figma data. So what does that mean in practice? Here are a few example variable use cases. With the REST API for variables specifically, it's gated behind enterprise. If you have an enterprise account, then you can use the read API, which allows you to keep your code base in sync with Figma files. That's one example use case. You can use it in a few other ways. And that'll allow you to quickly update all your collections automatically via code instead of using the Figma UI. So for instance, if you wanted to create language variables in your code by reading what's in your Figma files, that's something that you can do with the REST API. Some other example use cases involve the write API, which is gated behind an editor seat or an admin seat. So if you have enterprise and an editor seat, you can use that API token to be able to import variables from design systems. So if you have, for instance, colors, dimensions, and text variables that are in your design system, your code repo, or another source of truth, this is an easy way for you to bring those variables in really quickly. On top of that, if you combine both of those two things, you can bidirectionally sync design tokens or changes to them from a code base to Figma and vice versa. And you can use that API in your continuous integration or continuous deployment workflow. So that's a lot. Definitely feel free to ask questions and I'll be happy to answer them in the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to go into just kind of showing you how that works. And to do that, I'm going to use something called Postman. And what Postman lets me do is, without having to write that full script, I can just show examples of what this REST API looks like. So this is the REST API endpoint. The first one that I'm going to show is just how to see local variables in a file. And so this base URL here is just api.figma.com with the file key being the ID for my file. And when I send this request, it's going to be based off of this file over here, published variables test file, where I've already set up these two frames and these variables for Figma colors. If I send that request, I'm going to go ahead and see the variables that are in this file. So I see this Figma colors collection, and as well as the modes that are here. The modes that are here, and that includes color and transparent, and all of the values for each of those modes. And so one thing you might notice is that the values here are coming in RGBA, which is the format that the REST API expects. If you wanted to use your own colors, you would have to convert them to this RGBA format. So now that we've seen the local variables, let's try to create something. So I'm going to create both a float variable or a number variable and a color. And I'm going to go ahead and do that in this new variable collection with an initial mode called my mode. And I'm going to create these two variables. So you can see I have this create action, giving an ID for the variable, giving it a name, as well as a type, and which collection it's going to go into. And doing the same thing for that color variable, and then the values down here. And so when I run this, you see that request gets sent. And I can go back into my Figma file. I can look into my collections, and now I see that new variable collection. And lo and behold, we have our float variable and our color variable. So one more example I'm going to show is just kind of using this in a way to add multiple variables that are connected to each other. And so that's one right here where I'm putting together a bunch of text variables as an example of possibly using Figma to show different examples of languages. And so I have these text variables for English and for Spanish. I'm going to create the variables for hello and world with initial values of hello and hola for Spanish. And so if I go ahead and send that request, once again, we have a successful request. I'm getting these IDs over here are useful for automation. So it allows you to kind of chain different commands together if you're creating a script. And when I'm here, if I go to my text variables, now I see all the variables that are here, hello world, in English and in Spanish. So you can see a little bit of the power in these really simple examples of what you can do with the REST API. It just makes it really easy for you to create lots of these variables, as well as just making it really easy for you to just manipulate variables without having to deal with the Figma UI. And it's very specific. The use cases are very specific to your needs. So the REST API might work better for larger organizations, whereas the plugin API might suit your needs if you're a smaller team or smaller developer and you have one file that you want to work on or individual files. And so these are just different ways for you to automate your selection. So one thing that I wanted to also share is just a bunch of resources, including our variables plugin API docs, REST API docs, a few code samples, and specifically one use case where the Spotify engineering team and Spotify design team were able to use the REST API to create over 1,800 variables in their design system. And this is just another example of simplifying workflows. Great, and I'll hand it off back to Louis.
Thank you so much, Akbar. That was a really nice taster into the API. And we're going to drop also all these links in the resources later to follow up with as well. We're now going to switch over to the Ford team, and we have Jack with us, who'll be jumping in to do a little talk for us as well. Thanks, Jack.
Absolutely. Go ahead and share my screen here. Awesome. So everyone, thanks for joining, and thanks again to the folks at Figma for having me today. I just wanted to hop on here and give everyone a quick update on how my team at Ford has been implementing color variables and hopefully give you guys some useful insights along the way. So my teammates and I were fortunate enough to have the opportunity to speak at Config this year. It was such an amazing experience. And on top of that, we also got to pilot variables in its beta form before it was officially launched at Config, which was super exciting. And we've been able to, release our color variables in our design system, and we've gotten a lot of positive feedback and some great questions about it. So hopefully we can answer some of that today. So we began implementing our color variables across our multi-theme, multi-channel design system, and we get into this a lot more in detail in our config talk. But as a brief overview, Ford's design system supports 5 major platforms, ranging all the way from web and mobile apps all the way down to the in-vehicle digital experiences. And essentially our goal with leveraging variables was to use them in a way that allowed us to reduce the complexity of our design system structure. So you can see here, this is our former design system structure, essentially a library of libraries with a well-working system, but one that came with quite a bit of added complexity. So the great news is that with all of the awesome new powers we're afforded with variables, we've been able to significantly reduce that number of libraries that make up our design system. So now our structure looks a little something like this. But today we're going to focus strictly on how we've implemented color variables. So we just launched color variables about a week ago internally in our design system, and been getting some great feedback from our product design teams, but I want to briefly go through how we got there. So going back in time a bit, our color styles used to be housed in separate foundation libraries, and these libraries fed into corresponding component libraries specific to the brand and the platform. So because these libraries were parallel in structure, we could easily swap which foundation library our components were pulling from. And on top of that, we already had a successful semantic naming convention for our color styles that allowed for flexibility and scalability. This made implementing color variables so much easier. And a step further, we took it upon ourselves, before having that kind of first-party solution of variables, to create our kind of core primitive color tokens to fuel those color styles, the semantic color styles. So essentially, we started by creating a collection of primitive color variables and hid that collection in our library by putting a period at the beginning of the collection name. And I know there's some questions around this, so we can definitely get into that. But this was a huge missing piece in our design system, since before variables, we didn't have a first-party solution for backing our semantic color styles with a set of primitives. So that's where we started. And from there, we recreated our color styles in a theme color variable collection using the same alias naming conventions that we had on our color styles. We created modes for each brand and theme and nested primitive colors into each theme's mode. And as Louis mentioned earlier, there are now some great plugins that automate this process. Since we took this step before variables was officially launched, we did do it manually, but I think those plugins would probably save design teams out there quite a significant amount of time. So definitely something to look into. So after we had our primitive and semantic color variable collections created, we backed our existing color styles with our aliased color variables. Again, I know the plugins out there do this as well, but this step is incredibly important because it automatically creates that connection between your variables and any layer and any working file referencing a color style from this library. So once we backed our color styles, we pushed the library update out to our component libraries. And now you can see my components that are referencing variable backed color styles are now responding to mode changes. And technically we could have published our foundation library or published our component libraries and been done with it, since variable mode behavior is reflected in color styles. However, in an effort to continue reducing complexity and to encourage our design teams to begin using variables instead of color styles, we went into our component libraries after accepting the update from our foundation libraries and disconnected all color styles from all layers of all components. And because the color styles that these components were referencing are now backed by variables, disconnecting that color style from any given layer will leave that layer with a color variable applied to it. And there are also plugins out there that will automate this process for you. But again, since we took this step before variables officially launched, we took the time to do it manually. But again, plugins out there can probably save a ton of time in that exercise. So we had successfully implemented variables and launched them However, this did not come without a little bit of unavoidable manual work for our product design teams. So because any new document using variables is always going to default to the first mode in all collections, all of our working files, regardless of the branded component libraries that our product design teams were using, converted to wireframe colors once they accepted the update. And that's because that wireframe mode is the first mode in our theme collection. So we walked our product designers through the process of setting modes at a page, selection, component, frame, and layer level to make getting back to their original design intent quick and effortless. And from there, we encourage our product design teams to exclusively use color variables from here forward. And we plan to unpublish our color styles from our foundation libraries in the coming weeks once we've assured all of our product design teams have accepted our foundation and component library updates. And once that's done, any layers referencing color styles from the library, regardless of if they're within a component or not, will automatically be tied to a color variable. So to leave you guys with a few takeaways, one piece of advice I would give you is, regardless of if you're using a plugin, if you're doing it manually, definitely back up your existing color styles with color variables to create that connection, and make sure your components are updated with these variable backed color styles if your colors live in a separate library from your components. And lastly, don't unpublish those color styles until you have assured yourselves that your product design teams have accepted that update from the library that your variables live within. Next would be, communicate with your product design teams as you implement variables. We, of course, did not want to treat our release of color variables just like any other library release. So we hosted 2 recorded sessions where we educated our product design teams on how variables work in general and how they've been integrated into the context of Ford's design system. We found that this really helped our designers grasp the concept of variables and gave them the knowledge they needed to begin using variables in their working files immediately. Next, alias color variables gave us a great start in terms of supporting multiple brands within our design system, but sometimes the mapping of color does not line up perfectly across brands in terms of its application to components. So sometimes, in these instances, we will plan to create component-specific color variables to capture those differences. But I do want to caution against leaning too heavily into that, just so that you're not creating any unnecessary layers of aliasing that don't necessarily need to be there. I would probably reserve this tactic just for instances where you cannot get your mapping one-to-one across different brands in terms of using those semantic color variables. And then lastly, be considerate of your development partners. So we've been collaborating a ton with our developers to successfully implement variables in code. We've allowed insights from that partnership to ensure that we're implementing variables identically to how they will be structured in code. And we're also working on leveraging Figma's variables REST API to create an automated pipeline between Figma and our code kits so that our developers can benefit from the power of variables as well. And again, I know there are some great plugins out there that have already scratched the surface on this. And yeah, we're definitely going to be looking into that and trying to see how we can sort of automate that pipeline. So that's all I've got for now. I'm also looking forward to answering some of your questions, but just wanted to thank you guys for joining us today and thank the Figma team again for having me.
Thank you, Jack.
Amazing. Love that, Jack. Always so cool to see how people are using this in the real world as well. Speaking of the real world, I want to talk about the future real world and what is up and coming for variables. I know that there's a ton of feature requests that we have right now and a ton of demands from you, the users. We totally understand that as we're working through and iterating through this beta, just know we will be actually communicating a lot of these things out so you can expect what is coming next for this. And so I want to dive into that right now. The first thing that we're going to talk about is in early August, we're going to be launching code syntax. This is a way for you to actually document what tokens the variables actually map to and how you actually express those in code. That way, if you have a developer that is coming in and inspecting a design, regardless of if they are working in a web platform or on iOS or on Android, when they actually inspect your layers, ideally what they will see is your actual specified way of representing that in code. So that's really going to help with that handoff experience quite a bit. The other thing that we're going to be launching is color scoping. Number scoping is available today, but we also have color scoping coming. And this will allow you to set things such as, hey, only reveal this color for a stroke or only reveal this for a fill. You can also specify layer types as well. So if you have, for example, text brand as one of your variables in your collection, you can specify that text brand only applies to text layers. So we're really excited for that. It should optimize that experience for designers that are actually consuming these variables. And it should also make it just a little bit more documented around where you should use these variables. We are aware that with semantic collections, oftentimes you can have hundreds of these. So use color scoping, absolutely. The next thing I want to talk about is past August. These are the things that we're really going to be focusing on, which is typography. We're hugely aware that's a necessity for any sort of multi-brand situation. And even if you're representing different platforms such as web or iOS or Android, you're going to want to be able to swap out type. I'd recommend that for the time being, don't do things like creating components around just typography and swapping out those components. Rely on type styles for right now. You can always still use the swap out library feature for styles, and that'll actually support that typography difference between different platforms. The next thing I want to talk about are effects. We will be allowing you to bind things such as color to effects, such as a drop shadow color. And we'll also be looking at allowing you to bind numbers to things such as the drop shadow spread or the position of it as well. The last thing I want to talk about here is gradients. We will be allowing you to bind colors to gradient stops. At that point, once you do that, you'll be able to actually have a style still of that gradient that includes variables inside of it, which will mean that it should still be reactive between modes. This is one of the ways that we're really considering styles in the future, is styles are collections of elements. And for us, a gradient is a collection of values. It's a documented collection of multiple gradient stops, all mapped to individual variables. Because of that, we encourage that you still use styles for gradients. It's just that they'll be backed by variables in the future. The next thing I want to talk about, because I saw a few questions about this in the chat, is expressions and reactive variables. This is something we're looking into right now, but what we really want to be able to do in the future is be able to document a variable and say, hey, this variable is equal to this variable plus this variable. So you're actually creating an expression of those, and that'll really help with numerical variables especially. That'll be the first thing we're really targeting here. That way, if you have, say, a small padding and the size of that is 0.5 times your base unit or 1 EM, you can actually calculate that inside of your actual authoring window itself. The next thing I want to talk through is component property support. Today, one of the issues with variables is if you have a, say, Boolean property, or if you have a text property, you can't map a variable to each one of those, which means you really have to choose between the two of them. That's not the ideal state by any means. We really want these component properties to effectively be component scoped variables. And because of that, they're a part of that entire chain of the primitive, semantic, and component layer. Because of that, we're going to be launching not only support for the ability to bind variables to component properties, but we're also going to be looking into shipping color properties. Color properties will allow you to document things such as button background, and then map that button background property to, say, a brand VG variable. That way, it'll still be interpreted between modes, but you also have a documented prop for that particular component itself. The other benefit of using a property in that situation is we'll have preferred values for those properties as well. So if you have a button that can contain states such as a brand background or a brand background hover, you can suggest both of those in the actual color prop as well. The last thing that I really want to mention here as far as the future is extended collections. This is the way that we're looking to support a multi-brand situation. Extended collections will allow you to define a base collection that has things such as a light and a dark mode. And then what you'll be able to do in a separate file is take that collection, extend it, and then add your brand specific overrides. So if you have two products, one with a brand color of blue and another with a brand color of purple, in that extended collection, what you can do is redefine all of the brand variables to have all of them mapped to purple instead of blue. And then when a user subscribes to both of them, what they'll see is not only a swapper between light and dark modes, they'll also see a swapper between those individual collections as well. That way they can express a multi-brand situation. That'll be available on Enterprise only. All right. With that, I want to jump into a few questions. We've got a bunch of them coming through here, so let's jump right in. The first one that we have is, does hiding primitives with a period also work? And also an additional question about scoping. The first thing I want to touch upon here before I hand it over to Jack, because I know that Jack encountered some of this, is one thing I would recommend is, instead of using a period to hide, one of the things you can do as well if you create a variable is, if you go into the edit variable options, you can just click the hide from publishing. That way you're not polluting the name itself, and it's a little bit more specific for users. So I'd recommend using that instead of using the period or the underscore hacks. But otherwise, Jack, I'd love to get your opinion here around how Ford approached the actual scoping issue.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. So yeah, currently we are using the period to hide our primitive color variable collection as a whole. I think there's definitely a lot of merit in individually just hiding all of the variables as opposed to the entire collection, especially because there's just one mode, so that won't be visible to consuming designers regardless of the method used. I think the reason behind not wanting to expose those primitive variables to our consuming designers is to make sure that they're getting that modality of the theme collection that we've created, and making sure that they are using those semantic color variables to apply to their layers, to make sure that, one, it responds to those theme mode changes, and two, to make sure that the color is being used in its intended way for that given brand mode.
Totally. Yeah, I really like your point about using it to make sure that designers have that modality control to swap between modes. I think that's a really important thing. One thing that I think you can do there as well is actually separate these out into two separate files, have your primitives in one file and your semantic layer in another, and then only enable by default that semantic layer for all of your designers. That way they still have access to the primitive variables as well. And so they can go into their library and enable that if needed. But that's an explicit action where they're actually making a conscious decision there. And that way they know, hey, this isn't one that's been enabled by default. I still need to pick specific colors, so it's valuable for me to have this on, but they understand the ramifications of that. All right, we're going to jump into the next one here, which is, any tips on separating styles and variables from a single design system file, from Ryan. Louis, you want to take this one?
Yes, definitely. This is, we're touching on a question under a question here about the importance of planning. However, to answer the question very short, you can cut and paste styles between files. So if you create all your variables in one place and then suddenly think, actually the styles need to live somewhere else, create a new file, select all the styles, cut them out, paste them in the separate file, and republish. Everything will still be connected. However, planning, as I said, is the most important thing when it comes to variables. And personally, I'd recommend you check out just creating a spreadsheet for all your planning. In fact, that's something that Figma did for our token migration, and Jacob spoke about that at one of our conferences. So there was a talk you can go and see where he talks about that in depth. But create a spreadsheet, map all your semantic names out, map all your variables out, then go in and start creating them.
It's amazing how useful spreadsheets still are. Like, such a simple pattern, but honestly, like, use the tools that make sense for the situation. We leverage spreadsheets to such a benefit for us internally. And especially now, because you can create some plugins as well. Even if you're defining these in a spreadsheet, it's not that hard to actually export that as a CSV and then import that into Figma, running just a little bit of code. All right, let's jump into the next one here, which is it typical for primitive libraries to live in their own unique file that is dedicated specifically to these collections? And then that file gets consumed in other library files that reference that primitive collection. So I think this one actually goes back to the question earlier around hiding both the primitive layer versus the semantic layer. And for this one, I'd recommend the exact same thing. Split these out into two separate files if that is something where that makes sense for your situation. If you have, say, a set of designers who are strongly encouraged only to use that semantic layer, then absolutely only enable that semantic layer by default by including that in a separate file. If, for example, though, you have a brand that makes heavy use of illustrations, and so you need access to those primitives, then at that point, it makes a little bit less sense. So do what makes sense for your situation. There isn't a single answer that makes sense for all situations here. Okay.
That also sets you up for a future where you may need multiple different semantic libraries. So that's just, it removes that problem from the future that may exist.
Totally. And yeah, being flexible for the future and for just migrations for anything else, such a valuable thing to have. Okay, how do you make sure you don't go overboard and create too many semantic variables while still making sure that you have enough for your use case from Spondon? Louis, you want to touch upon this?
Yeah, this is very easy. And it's something that we do naturally when we start to think about every single implementation in isolation. What that typically ends up with is loads and loads of component tokens or component variables, if you will. Whereas we'd prefer not to go down that route. We would rely on the semantic layer in its entirety, if possible. You may need very specific variables for use cases, but if you take a step backwards and think in a more generic way at the semantic layer, you should ideally not get too out of control. I would recommend going and checking out a bunch of the leading design systems to check out how they have structured this. So Adobe Spectrum, Polaris, the Asana team have done great work as well. They rely on a very small collection in effect. So planning again is also really important. So just step back before we go and create them all and think about in that generic semantic layer, what you can create to apply in a much more global way.
Totally. One thing that we do internally here as well at Figma is in our actual variable schema for the semantic layer, we have about 1,200 proper actual variables that make sense for that schema. But inside of our library, we only have about 400 that are actually published out. What we found is that oftentimes with the semantic layer, you typically have a subset of variables that are used extremely often. And then you have another even larger chunk sometimes that really aren't used that much at all. So consider, like, do designers actually need access to this in the core library? Again, one thing that you could do is split these out into a separate actual collection. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that because it'll create two separate mode switchers, but it still may be something that you consider. Do what makes sense for your designers and really treat your design system as a product. Make sure that you are shipping to the designers things that are valuable to them. And it may be that only a subset of that collection is something that's valuable to them. All right. Will there be a way to convert text properties of components into text strings? Or will text properties and text strings be compatible with each other in the future? It's that second half that's going to be true. We are definitely looking at allowing you to map these things so they can work together in unison. What I'd recommend is don't go and refactor all of your text properties away in order to actually support just mapping them to text variables. We will have that out soon. All right. What will the future of styles be if I convert them all to variables and use the variables to build my components? Louis, what do you got?
Yeah, I look at the future as 12 plus month cycle. So if you're in your design system, you've probably got a roadmap. You're starting to think about where variables fit in there. What does that mean for our immediate 3, 6, 9, 12 months plan? And that may look like a phasing out of styles over time as we introduce the concept of composite variables. But right now, I continue with that pattern of styles being fed by variables until the point where you may or may not be using styles anymore. But I think this is an important point, is conceptually, all of our design teams currently understand styles as a concept. If we suddenly switch to start talking about this brand new thing, variables, we may lose some of our designers, we may lose some of the adoption. So I would continue with that mental model of styles everywhere, feeding them with variables. And over time, we may transition into a world where it's only variables in the system, but that's way in the future. So look at the path in a longer term roadmap sense.
Absolutely. And I definitely think that even in the future, where we are building out a lot more support for variables, even things like composites, I still think there's going to be a situation where styles still make sense. So don't abandon them completely. We're still going to support them. Definitely don't do like a full out, just like, no, cut all variables out or all styles out. Embrace them right now. They still make sense for a lot of situations. All right, we got another one here. Are we able to attach a variable to master components, instances, or variants? Right now, you can definitely use this to attach them to variants, meaning what you can do is you can map a string variable to an instance's variant selector. This is specifically only for instances at the moment. We're looking into it to allow you to actually map this to a master component as well, so that immediately upon insertion, you have a variable mapped to the variant. And so that way it can be reactive between modes. We're still working on things behind the scene for that from an engineering point of view. Stay tuned. We're still trying to figure this one out. Just hold tight if you can.
Yep, and
All right.
if I could jump in there, Jacob.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this is something that the Ford team has been leaning into heavily, creating this multi-platform component library where we can use that string variable applied to the instance of a component to change between, say, in vehicle versus mobile. I would say, as you guys are working through implementations such as that, to really look deep into your component anatomy and make sure that you're not assigning modes to deeper layers of the component that can then not be affected by the sort of wholesale change at the parent level of the component.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You want to make sure your system stays flexible. And if you're building in these explicit modes or these explicit variants throughout your entire system, it's going to be hard to really diagnose and triage where things changed. The other thing is as you're handing off to developers in that situation, if you have mode overrides all over the place, you've added a bunch of complexity into that design in the page itself. So definitely be careful with that. Make sure you design things and you architect things in a way that is flexible for sure. All right. Would we get alpha control on color variables? I'm currently forced to detach from primitive variables to have a 0.5 opacity for semantic variables from Ben. We're seeing this question a lot, and I'm going to take a small part. I'm going to pass it off to Louis for a quick tip after. But one thing is we're still looking into this. One thing that we really want to ensure here is that we have compatibility with code. And so for me, I want to make sure that there is a standard practice for how to represent this with, say, CSS variables. We do have the color mix function, which is a new thing to the CSS format, but I just want to make sure that we're playing with that in the right way. And we're thinking about that holistically in a way that makes sense for the future of CSS and also for how this actually works and interprets between iOS and Android. It's something we're still working through. We're doing designs on this right now, and we're trying to figure it out. Hold tight for now. But we also have a quick tip in the meantime from Louis over here on what we can do in the meantime.
Indeed, we do need to continue working with our system. So we probably want to support for something right now. And what I would recommend doing is actually creating another variable for that opacity of the string that you want to use. So taking this example of a dark gray, create another variable, append the opacity as a number into that primitive, and then alias that into your semantic layer with an appending at the end for the opacity in there. So text primary, you get another variable, text primary opacity. You know exactly what they are. And then in the future, you can remap to the opacity variable that we do ultimately ship. It just gives it a very clear indication. What is the variable? Where does it live? How do we remap that back in the future?
Totally. All right. We got a couple more questions. We're running up on the end here. Can you shed light on how a variable might take away the need for a master frame where all the permutations of variants and properties are rendered out? Is this indeed the case, or will we still have these with variables? Louis, do you want to take a stab?
Well, I think this hints at two things, maybe. The first thing it hints at is probably consolidation, and the second thing is documentation. On the consolidation side, variables absolutely will be able to consolidate your styles, at least in half if you're supporting a light and dark theme. And if you're doing theming in components, it's also going to reduce the amount of components you need to support straight away. However, for documentation, you probably still want people to know they exist. So I would still recommend creating those sticker sheets for all of your permutations of components that you do create. It might mean you end up creating less components or maintaining less components, but the permutations of those still need to exist somewhere.
Absolutely. I think one of the other things I'd recommend here is as you are doing a refactor of your system for variables, don't go overboard. There's still going to be situations where variants make sense for a component. One of the things that I've seen is a lot of people are looking at, say, button hover states, and they're making that a separate mode, which I really wouldn't recommend doing. I'd recommend maintaining variants for that, because one thing I want you to think about is if you're selecting the top level frame, how many modes should a user see? remember that at the top level frame, you see all the possible modes of all the children. And so really embrace that, use variants in that situation, use variables when it actually makes sense to do so. And as you're actually re-architecting these things, make sure, to Louis' point, that you still actually have proper documentation in place. So it may make sense to have those instances out in a new mode. All right. Ooh, one for Akbar. How do developers get to see these different modes in dev mode? When I've been testing in dev mode, I noticed I could only see one mode and have any way to swap modes when looking at a specific component. Akbar, what do you got?
Yeah, so for this question, I also answered this in the Q&A. The issue is that dev mode is read-only, and so there's no way to change modes in read-only without designer intervention. And so the recommendation that I would have is to make sure that your designer shows different versions of the frames with those modes applied, because in dev mode, when a mode is applied, you'll see it surfaced in the inspect panel. But thank you for that feedback, and feel free to please share that in the dev mode feedback as well, because that's a great way for us to understand that this is a core need. And I can definitely see that being something that we can look at.
Totally. And we've only got 2 minutes left here, and that is our last question. I love it. All right, y'all, we're going to close up. As a reminder, you can also see any future live streams that we have over at figma.com/events. This session was recorded, so this recording will be up and available on YouTube shortly. And definitely, if you have any suggestions or ideas, hit us up at community@figma.com or post on our forum as well. We're always reading those things and definitely looking forward to hearing from you. Louis, thank you so much today. Akbar, Jack, thank you for joining us as well as our guest today. And we'll catch you all for the next one.